The Bears rolled themselves into a whole mess of trouble in the nation's capital last weekend, and now they have to try and win their way out of it. We'll talk about all that, the upcoming contest versus the suddenly relevant Arizona Cardinals, and more this week on Bear Era. All right, Ciaran, after all that, and it's been a lot, I have to ask you, how are you, man?
Oh, I've been better. It was, yeah, it's been a weird few days. I'd say a lot of Bears fans are going through very similar emotions after that game, where it, for everybody to know, it was about almost midnight by the time that game was over for me, which just because the game felt like it went on for ages. Um, and I just sat there scrolling on my phone, listening, watching all the mayhem after that game, and it felt very numb. Just like thinking back of what actually happened, like a game that maybe an hour earlier you're like, this is over. There's no way we're gonna win. To then maybe 45 minutes later being like, surely we're going to win this game, and then the final play happens, and it's more of it's disbelief of how we got there. And I think that's what made it worse. I think if and there's probably a lot of people that would agree with me that if the Bears didn't find a way to get back in it and to be winning with 12 seconds left on the clock, um I don't think it would have been as much of a sticking point. I actually don't think there would be as much of the pressure that is on this team as there is this week if that didn't happen and they just ended up losing that game 12-0. I don't think there would be all this pressure, but it's the way they lost that game, which I think is gonna hurt a lot of Bears fans this week and has made a lot of Bears fans very angry and very mad at what they saw. And I don't blame them because I went through all 7 stages of grief over the last couple of days, and I think this podcast is going to be good to be able to talk about it.
Therapy, that's right. It's purely therapeutic Bears talk. And there's a lot to get into. And I completely agree with you. It was the way that it happened. We'll talk about all that. We'll get into it. But first, thanks to all of you who've been coming back week after week. We've been at this a month now on Bear Era. Everybody that has listened, watched, commented, subscribed over the last 4 weeks. There's more than 500 of you now, more joining every day. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to. We're on a roll and we want you along for the ride. We're going to be creating great Bears content throughout the rest of the season, and we would welcome you on this bus. There are some other folks already in seats with us. One is Blue Wire Podcasts. We are on the Blue Wire Podcast Network. That's where you can find our audio, and we thank them as a primary partner. And Homage Clothing. You got your Homage gift bag finally.
I did.
So we're
Thank
all
God.
looking good now. Yeah, exactly. Thanks to that international shipping, but Homage keeping the crew looking sharp this year. Thanks very much to them as well. Anything you buy at Homage with the link on the screen, we get a cut of. Doesn't matter whether it's Bears gear, national parks, hoodies, Major League Baseball stuff, you name it. They've got a great selection. It's all comfy and soft. I promise you won't be sorry if you pick some up, and it's a great way to help support Bear Era as well. With that, we're going to launch into Top Trio. Going to be a bit of a longer section than normal this week because we have lots of things to talk about. Ciaran, what's your point of interest for the week?
So normally we talk about a point of interest or a point of emphasis on an upcoming game. Do I have a point of emphasis on the upcoming Cardinals game with the Bears? No, I do not. And why is that? Because I actually think it's important that we talk about what happened last week, what we witnessed against the Commanders, and honestly, to give a voice and a platform, and we read all the comments on the videos, and to kind of give you guys that kind of platform to have your opinions be shared. And because I've seen it quite a lot over the last couple of days, that there's people that will say it's just a loss. It's if they win the next two games, it's not going to matter. And I couldn't disagree more. And it's not just to do, we mentioned it earlier on, that it's the way they lost. But honestly, for me, I look back at the last couple of days. I've I took in the game, obviously. I took in the post game press conferences. Normally, I don't go listening to all the interviews after a game, but that game made me so annoyed at the team. I made me so annoyed at the coaching staff that I went out and listened to pretty much every single interview that happened afterwards over the last couple of days, and it's a really tough listen for you as a Bears fan. And I can't remember. I think it was on Get Up where people were saying that Bears fans have a right to be annoyed and to be pissed off with the organization, to be pissed off with the coaching staff. And that's how I felt the last couple of days. And I think that's a big part of it, right? So normally when we're talking about a point of emphasis, we would be thinking about, okay, the game last week, the decision making of the coaching staff should be the worst possible thing because there was three boneheaded plays that happened and they should never happen in such a close game. And honestly, that's not even the worst part of it for me. What made me so perturbed was not only that those plays happened, but then there's an analysis after the game or even the next day in those interviews from the head coaches or from the head coach and some of the other coaches on this team. And they doubled and tripled down on the stupidity that we saw on Sunday. And that's the unfortunate thing. And what makes me worried as a Bears fan is there's a clear divide between the thought process of the players versus the thought process of the head coach. Everybody knows what happened on Sunday should never have happened. The three plays, obviously, we're kind of speaking about, and there was more, but these are just the three main ones. The touchdown that wasn't, because they didn't hand the ball off to Roshan Johnson and they gave it to Doug Kramer and he fumbles the ball. And honestly, I feel bad for Doug Kramer because he should never have been put in that situation. And that is down to the coaching staff. And the fact is, Eberflus was asked about it after the game. He didn't really want to answer it. He was then asked on Monday and he doubled down saying it was a good play and they put it in the install all week. And then 2 hours later, you hear DJ Moore saying he couldn't believe that it was put into that situation. Now, DJ Moore is a member of that leadership group that Matt Eberflus likes to talk about and how important it is. And for me, when you start hearing players question coaching decisions in the media, that's when this gets worrying, because if they're saying this in the media, what are they saying behind closed doors and what are they saying to each other? And that's when you start to see is if they do start to lose some games, when does this completely fall apart? Because there are signs there that there is a divide. And you wouldn't expect that for a team that could have been 5-2. That's only the first one. You obviously, the Hail Mary is one thing. The stupidity of Tyreek Stevenson, okay, that's the obvious play. But the one beforehand where you have Eberflus defending what he did and that he just let the Commanders have those 17 yards and said it didn't really matter, and still to this day keep saying that, even though his safety and Kevin Byard said that it was an important, that he disagreed with what happened. The fact that the Commanders head coach Dan Quinn emphasized the importance of that play and allowing them to win the football game. And then you hear, I think it was Courtney Cronin mentioned it, that there was coaches and other teams that are going to show that play and show the sequence of events to their teams on what not to do to win a game at the end. And that's what kind of annoyed me more than what actually happened, because we knew that what they did was stupid at the time. But the fact is that the lack of accountability from your head coach, to actually just admit when you made a mistake in a game, and that you can just admit that, and then fans would be like, okay, that's fine. We know that there was a mistake. They've seen that this has happened, and they're going to try and rectify it. My worry is they don't actually keep themselves accountable to where they're going to admit that that was a mistake. And unfortunately, when that happens, you run the risk of that happening again. And that's the weird thing. The weirdest one about the Hail Mary for me was the way they defended it was chalk and cheese from the end of the first half to the end of the game. The end of the first half made a lot of sense because they put more pressure on the Commanders, and guess what? The Commanders weren't able to do much. And then at the end of the game, you basically gave them to them. And look, we'll talk about Tyreek Stevenson and what he did a little bit later, but I just want to get that out there. That was my point of emphasis, that this coaching staff doesn't really resemble a leadership of this team. And when you have players and coaches saying two separate things in the media, I think it is kind of time to be a little bit worried about the direction of the team, because that's kind of giving everybody a little insight to actually what the dynamic is within that locker room right now.
This was a team that wasn't expecting to win necessarily. Certainly not. I know a lot of fans had Super Bowl aspirations, but with a rookie quarterback, that's pretty ridiculous. Could they have made the playoffs? Can they make the playoffs still? They can. It's certainly possible. I'm not saying they're not going to, but this was not a team that was expecting to roll off 12, 13, 14 wins this year. Probably not even 10. If they had a 9-win season, got a wild card berth, it would be a very successful season. But then you win a couple. Then you win a couple more. And then you're 4-2. And then you have a very winnable game in front of you. And for the first time, you don't take advantage of that. You work sort of actively in many ways to pitch that. And then everybody goes, well, wait, we had it. We had the lead with 12 seconds. We've started to expect to win these games, which is good. That's what you want to do. You want to build a winning culture. You want to build a team that knows how to win and expects how to win. And the Bears started taking baby steps to do that. And now this is the first one they dropped. And you see these divisions and you see these disagreements. And Courtney also said she saw things this week in Chicago that she has not seen previously in her time covering the Bears, which was players openly questioning coaching decisions. That's new. That's yet another sort of flare coming up that says, ooh, there are ripples in the water here and they're bigger than you might think. And it leads to my question of how this Bears team is going to respond to what is going to be a very loud week. There is no way around that with the way that game ended and a lot of the decisions, not just the ones at the end, that led up to that. There were always going to be questions. And you're right. There's a good way to deal with that. I mean, this is classic crisis management. And if you look at case studies of crisis management from corporations, teams, whatever, there's a good way to do it, which is the way that you said: stand up, take accountability, say this is what happened, this is what we're doing to make sure it doesn't happen again. And there's bad ways, which is, nah, it didn't really happen, we don't think it's a big deal, nothing to see here, move along. Everybody's just going to stay and get louder. And the Bears made, in my estimation, another misstep today. They closed the Wednesday practice to the media. Now they're still going to have their media sessions. It's going to be a walkthrough instead of a practice, but anything they're going to do to try and put the lid on this is just going to make it worse. It's going to ramp the pressure up. And that's a hard environment to work in when you're in a building and there's infighting and there's a lot of noise. I mean, Trubisky famously turned off the TVs. Eberflus is trying to turn off the media. Like, it doesn't work. That's the wrong way to do this. So they're already, again, sort of turning up their own degree of difficulty. And that's a difficult place to be. But I'm not only worried about how they respond, to what you said earlier about how they win or don't win the next 2 games. Like, I need to see this for the rest of the season because it's not going to get a lot easier because of the way this has all gone down. and the sequencing. The Cardinals are a plucky team all of a sudden with a lot to play for. They're tied, their division's wide open. They're not a perfect team by any stretch, and we'll talk about that not only amongst ourselves, but with our guests today. And it's going to be a tough game. I don't think anybody in the middle of summer would have said, oh, Bears Cardinals, this is going to be a good football game. But it actually looks like it's going to be. So they have a depleted pass rush. Their leading pass rusher out of a very weak pass rush is now out for the season. They have holes that can be exploited. But the Bears have pivoted from, hey, this is probably a game you can win. Maybe you can steal one, to you kind of have to win this game. It's not necessarily a must-win game, but if you lose it, all the volume's going to get turned up. It's going to get louder. The questions are going to get bigger. The pressure's going to get greater going into the next week versus the Patriots, who are starting to find their footing. Again, not a good team. Definitely a winnable game for the Bears. But if you don't, it's the big bad stick. And if you lose both of those games, forget it. It's going to be calamity and klaxon bells and future of the coaching staff, and you're going to start to see this thing unravel. So they've gone from a place where, hey, maybe the Cardinals and Patriots are winnable games. I think they are against the talent that the Bears have on the field, but we're talking about a lot more than talent here, and they've put themselves in this pressure cooker kind of spot where, yeah, they look winnable, but you better win them, because if you don't, then what? Then you're starting to talk about falling out of, possible playoff percentage picture. And the week after that is Packers week. And we know what Packers week is like around here. So it's just the kind of role you don't want to build yourself. So you have these two games. Yeah, you can win them, but now you kind of have to. And I'm really interested to see how this team sort of circles the wagons or does whatever they need to do, pull themselves up by their bootstraps inside the building, shuts out all the outside noise, if that's even possible, and goes and plays good football, learns from the mistakes on the field that we all saw, or whether they continue to come out flat, which is another thing that we'll talk about, coming out looking like that after a bye week. Inexcusable from a coaching standpoint. I don't care whether you're talking about offense or defense. Defense kept this team in the ball game. Torrey Taylor did a great job limiting the damage field position wise, but again, he shouldn't have had to. And the offense stumbled bad for 3 and a quarter quarters. Like, they just didn't do anything. And that is another indictment of a coaching staff when you're coming off a bye and you come out that flat. So there's a lot of questions. I would say way more questions than there were last week, even though, look, the Bears probably shouldn't have won that game. Like you said, if they hadn't gotten close at the end, we wouldn't be having these conversations. You're like, hey, they played like crap against the Commanders. They lost. It's on to the Cardinals. It'd be a fairly quiet week. It is the exact opposite of that in Chicago right now.
Yeah, you mentioned it. I think the key word you mentioned was response. How is this team? How are the coaches? How's everybody going to respond? And unfortunately, you mentioned these have become must-win games, but to a point, it's how you win them as well. I don't think you can now squeak through the Cardinals and the Patriots and you end up 6-3. But then if you squeak through those two games, no one's going to genuinely believe that you're going to be able to beat the Packers, Lions, or Vikings. So then you start to lose that momentum that you were getting. Like, everyone was so excited for this game that you didn't see in previous seasons. And it just seems like the air has completely gone out. When you look at the fan base, when you look at how people are talking about this team, we shouldn't be talking about a coach getting fired when you were potentially when you should have gone 5-2. Like, that shouldn't happen. But unfortunately, the reason you are not 5-2 is the coaching staff. And that is the biggest indictment from this week. The coaches should never be the reason you lose a football game. And unfortunately, that's what happened this week. And look, they need to respond, and so does the team. They need to respond positively, and they need to respond by going out there and being angry about what happened last week, but being controlled. Stop with the ill discipline. If you stop with the ill discipline on a very baseline, you have a better chance of winning. And if they were able to do that against against the Commanders, they probably would have won that football game.
I would agree, and I think there's only one way out. I know it sounds a lot like gloom and doom. We're not trying to focus on that. We're trying to be realistic about where the Bears are at this moment, which is a pivotal moment in the season. And there is one way out of this, and it's winning football games. That is the only thing that will quiet it down, and it will quiet it down. If they were able to roll off 2 more wins, it will be a lot quieter than it is right now. If they are competitive against the Packers or steal one from them, things will get a lot quieter. If they lose all 3 of those games, the opposite happens. The volume meter is going to go through the roof, and it's going to be very hard to concentrate as a player, as a coach, as an administrator from that point on, because there is going to be a lot of noise around the Bears at that point, and it's going to be negative. And the only way you can tamp that down, the one thing that fixes everything in the NFL, is winning, and they're going to have to do it. That brings us to our fan question of the week. Why don't you read the fan question for us this week, Ciaran, and we will see if we can get this fan an answer.
Larvel Jones says, Tyreek Stevenson, just exactly how important is he to this defense? After everything that happened tonight, he might be a problem.
He is important to this defense. Let's not mince words. The defense looked much worse without him out there when he was going through his injury. And he needs to be more disciplined. It wasn't just the last play. Everybody will focus on the last play, and rightfully so. There's no reason for what he was doing. And if he was supposed to be the savior player, which is the deeper than the deepest, basically like a free safety, and he didn't because he was unprepared, ran over there at the last minute, inexcusable. Like, the Bears wouldn't have lost the game if he'd either played his responsibility, or the crazy thing is just kept jawing at the fans because he probably wouldn't have popped the ball up. He is the guy that touched it. But even before that, he had his run-in with Terry McLaurin, and you said, hey, if you lose the ill-disciplined piece of this, right? And this was the book on Stevenson coming out. When I wrote my pre-draft stuff on him, he is an aggressive player. He is a physical player. He was a handsy player, and he was a mouthy player. And I don't have problems with any of that at the cornerback position because it's kind of necessary. You need to be most of those things. But when you draft one of those players, your expectation is they'll spend a year figuring that out. They'll spend a year trimming that down to league standards that don't draw them a lot of flags, play within the system, and use all the things that you did draft them for: the length, the speed, the toughness, which he has all of those things, and he's shown them on the field too. So the problem here is we're in the middle of his second season, and he's still doing this kind of stuff. So when you say he might be a problem, that right there might be a problem. Him in this defense, it's a great fit. Opposite Jalen Johnson, it's somebody that they can count on. They can play press. He can play off. He's tough in the run fit. Like, all those things are good, and the Bears defense likes him for those things. But when you start adding the negatives, DPI, being handsy, being mouthy, being undisciplined, especially in the way that he was at the end of the game, DJ Moore came out and said, hey, we're going to have to address this as captains. Yeah, you certainly are. There's no way to let that slide. And he should sit for a little bit. And by a little bit, that's up to them. A half, 3/4, whatever. That's how you get people's attention. Hey, if you continue to do this, it's a liability and we're going to sit you down. Now, should he be, I've seen, out on the street, on Mars, in the XFL? No. Everybody screws up. I screw up. You screw up. If you're listening to this at home, you screw up too. He's a young player with a lot of talent. And if he can learn from this, just like we're talking about the Bears, how does he respond? Right? Came out in social media. Some people gave him a lot of credit for that. I'm more on the action side. I want to see what he does, not what he says. But he has the capacity to do that, right? Human beings have the capacity to change and say, oh man, that was brutal. I never want to go through that again. I'm going to straighten up and fly right, which means play within the defense, play my responsibility, play hard. I'm still going to get the occasional DPI. That happens to all cornerbacks, but tone it down and none of the extra stuff, right? Be in the right spot. Run your assignment. Know everybody's assignment. That's what he should be moving towards in his second year as a defender in this Bears system, to the point where he is becoming a young veteran leader. We'll see. is the answer. But do I want him off the team? No. Do I want him to change a lot of the things that we saw on Sunday because they're detrimental to the Bears winning? I absolutely do.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I don't think he is a problem for the defense because, as you said, when everyone is healthy, when he's out there, when Jalen Johnson's out there, when Kyler Gordon's out there, when Jaquan Brisker's out there, the aggressiveness that he shows is what they want in that defense. But the problem is it has to be controlled. Like Jalen Johnson talks smack the entire game, but it's controlled. It's not chaotic. And unfortunately for Tyreek is when he does things, it becomes very obvious, right? Like there's a lot of the DPIs where you're kind of questioning some of the things that he does. The flicking a guy in the eye, like what are you doing? Like that's ridiculous. That
Can't
things like
happen.
that it just can't. And it goes back to the whole premise of the top trio that I mentioned on the coaching staff: accountability. That is down to the head coach and the defensive coordinator to kick that out, because if they don't, that shows that you are not holding your players accountable and they feel like they can do whatever they want. And I think Cole Komet probably summed it up pretty well this week. I think it was on the Monday, and he said, respect the game. That's the most important thing that you need to be able to do. And unfortunately, Tyreek has been caught in various situations where he's not doing that, and he is playing those games, and it has really hit him hard. And I do agree. They need to do something more than lip service, where if it's a series or two, if it's a half, if it's a quarter, I don't care, but you need to show that there's some sort of accountability, even if it's where you have it where you're saying the starter is Terrell Smith or the starter is whoever, when you're coming out there and you're saying that Tyreek needs to earn his place back in the starting lineup, but then he plays a large portion of the snaps. I don't really mind in that regard. What I don't want to see is that it just becomes a nothing, and then we see this happen later on in the season in another important game because you didn't hold him accountable. And what made me concerned was the fact that you're hearing guys like DJ Moore come out and say what we're all thinking, that this can't happen. But then you're hearing from the coaches that they're not really addressing it like the players are, and that's a worry. But Tyreek needs to get it together because he's a good player and
Yep.
he fits this defense perfectly. He just needs to play within the defense. I think this is one where he comes out, he apologizes, face the media, and then plays a good football game against the Arizona Cardinals, and all is forgiven. And that's what he needs to go out and do. He needs to have a good game, and he needs to show that he's there for the team, and he's not there for Tyreek. If he's there for the team and people can see that, and people can see that he's busting his ass to play hard for this defense, fans are fickle. We'll hate him one week and then we'll love him the next week if he gets pick six. That's all he needs to do. He just needs to perform. If you can perform and you can play well, people will forgive you. And people, like you said, when I saw that, like I was asleep when it came out, but the next morning when I woke up and saw that he posted an apology, it's the one thing I hate when athletes do. I don't need to read an apology on social media. Like if you want to apologize when you're having an interview with the media, that's fine. That's one thing. Just actions on the field speak way louder. So that's what he needs to do this week. Get your head down, be ready for the Cardinals game, make plays, help the team win, and get the Bears back on track and back with some of that confidence that we were feeling prior to the Commanders game.
Yeah, for me, it's very much one foot in front of the other for Tyreek. He's got to go out there every day and practice, and he's going to have to start stacking a few games. There are going to be fans that are going to stay on this and sort of keep it in the back of their minds or the front of their minds until he stacks some good performances. And it's one foot in front of the other and be consistent and continue to show that growth. And if he does that, I'm with you. He is a good fit in this defense. Fans will come back around to him, and they'll love him when he makes good plays. So I hope he does. With that, brings us to this week's guest. We've got another terrific one for you. This week, we've got Darren Urban, who is the senior writer for the Arizona Cardinals. So he actually works for the team. He's been doing football media for over 25 years. I think he's worked for the Cardinals since 2007. So if you want to talk about an insider, we went out and got one for you, and you'll see that interview right here. This week on Bear Era, we are extremely lucky to have Darren Urban, the senior writer for the Cardinals, here to talk about the upcoming game with the Bears. Darren, how are you today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm looking forward to this game, maybe even a little bit more than I was in the offseason. I think a lot of sort of casual NFL fans probably didn't have this one circled, but both teams have worked themselves into a spot where it's going to be very interesting. The way we typically work it with our guests, Ciaran asks a question, I ask one, and then you get to ask one of us about the Bears. Ciaran is busy on the other side of the pond right now, but he did send his question along, and his is, the Cardinals being 4-4 shows a very inconsistent team. Some great wins versus the Dolphins, San Francisco, Rams, but tough losses to the Packers and Washington. What do the Cardinals need to do to get consistency in their performances, especially with a division which is wide open?
Well, I mean, obviously, if I knew exactly what they could do to be more consistent, maybe I'd be on the coaching staff. I certainly wouldn't be on the part where we're trying to analyze this. But I think essentially this team needs to find a way to look. They came into the year knowing that their defense was going to have some issues just because they're in the middle of a rebuild and they're trying to get the roster where they want it to be. And they probably don't have the defenders on the roster yet completely that they need. And then you add in, like every team, they've suffered a bunch of injuries, especially on the defensive line, which makes it that much tougher. So you're looking for a team that's going to be able to sustain itself through its offense. And quite frankly, the offensive issues, especially in the passing game, have shown up more often than you'd like. Now, they're coming off a game in Miami against the number one passing defense and looked great passing the ball. Their stars were stars, Trey McBride, Marvin Harrison Jr., Kyler Murray especially. So I think for them to be more consistent as a team, they've got to have that passing game week in and week out. They've proven that they can run the ball. They didn't do a great job against Miami, but I think Miami was looking to stop them first there, and I think that's one of the reasons the passing game opened up. If they can consistently throw the ball, though, with who they have, James Conner is going to be more successful more often than not, and they can score some points. That'll give them the real chance. I mean, their defense has had some nice outings and games where they've looked pretty decent. They held the Lions to 20 points. They held the Rams down. They got stops when they needed to against Miami. It wasn't clean all the way around. And then in San Francisco, they shut down the 49ers in the second half. So if they can get that kind of consistency offensively throwing the ball, I think overall the team's going to have a much better shot.
It's certainly what the fans have been interested in terms of the passing game equaling, I would say, preseason hype. And a lot of us are quite hyped for that, especially with the addition of Marvin Harrison Jr., but Trey in his breakout season last year, and even, bringing on Trey Benson in the running back room. We haven't seen that yet, but passing consistency is going to be a thing that I think propels the Cardinals. Now, on the flip side, my question goes towards the defense. How far can this Cards team go if they can't increase pressure on the passer? As you said, they got stops against Miami when they needed it. It didn't look great, but they're second worst in yards allowed per pass play. Only 14 sacks, tied for the eighth fewest. Second worst in QB pressure percentage and 22nd in blitz percentage. What does this team need to do to get to the passer, the opposing passer, to really make a deep postseason run?
Well, I mean, I think they're a team that they were always going to probably have to scheme it up a little bit to have that happen. I mean, Nick Rollis, the defensive coordinator, approaches this a lot differently than a lot of teams do. And you can make the argument. I was talking with some of my coworkers about this just before I came on. You can make the argument that they could use a pass rusher and make a trade for one. I'm not 100% sure they will. The way they like to work their front seven, and when I say front seven, it's mostly their defensive linemen and their edge guys. They want a heavy rotation. And they're asking their edge guys to do a lot more than a lot of edge guys do in terms of dropping into coverage, being versatile enough to do X, Y, and Z on any given play, more than just line up and go after the quarterback on every obvious pass situation. So I think that limits them and who they might chase after in terms of if they wanted to make a trade. And I think it also skews some things in terms of individual pass rushing performances. Now, all the numbers you said, it's a concern. I mean, you got to be able to pressure the quarterback. Now, I know like the Dolphins game, they weren't going to pressure Tua a whole bunch because the ball was gone before you could even breathe in a lot of those plays. So, looking at raw statistics isn't awesome when you're coming off a game like that. But when they played the Chargers a couple weeks ago, it did seem like Justin Herbert had tons of time to throw. Now, they did enough. The Chargers didn't get in the end zone. And again, I think the way they look at this defense, whether it's pass rush specific or overall, it's do enough so that the offense that we have built in this short amount of time that we've been in charge can score the points to win the game. Again, they're not looking to shut down the opposition. I mean, they are looking to do that. I just say
Sure.
I don't know if it's possible. And to me, like the Bears game is fascinating in this regard because you have an offense that has some weapons, but you have a rookie quarterback that's been very up and down. And so what does that mean? Can you do some things to confuse him? Can you do some things that, will make him hesitate and allow you to pressure him maybe more than some of the other quarterbacks? I think that's where this game gets super interesting in terms of the Cardinals defense.
Yeah, and I like what you said about playing complementary football in terms of we know what we've invested on offense and on defense. We're trying to make those two pieces work together. And for us, that means a defense where it's not a runaway and our offense can get in gear and hopefully outscore them. And that's the way we're planning on winning games. I love the team approach to that. And yeah, as you mentioned, the Bears are not a team that has a ton of balance right now. So it's interesting to see how they try and leverage that as well. What do you have for us about the Bears that you'd like to know a little bit more about?
Well, I got to go the obvious, which is, I was flying home from Miami yesterday, and fortunate the wireless internet allowed a lot of people to be watching games at that point, and there was a big uproar on the plane when everybody saw the Hail Mary. And the Cardinals have been on the wrong side of a Hail Mary before. They've been on the right side of a Hail Mary before.
Sure.
And I'm just wondering what you think the Bears' reaction is going to be to a game like that. I mean, they've won games. They've had a couple of decent games, but that one yesterday, it didn't feel like they played all that great, especially offensively most of the game. They come up big at the very end of the game. You think you haven't won, and then you don't. And then not only do you lose it on the Hail Mary, but we all know that this news cycle all week is going to be dominated about the possibility of, did you play that right? Did the defensive back who was off hollering at the Washington fans? That's going to be the storyline all week. That's a tough road to hoe when you're going on a whole week's worth of work before you go on a long road trip to Arizona.
Yeah, I don't disagree. This is not I will say, typical loss. It had multiple levels and multiple points of blame, quite frankly. The coaching staff did not play well, coach well for most of the game. That is more on the offensive side than the defensive side. But the defensive failure at the end is certainly going to be highlighted when you have a head coach who is supposedly a defensive specialist. And I would say made not one, but two errors in terms of allowing that 13-yard uncontested pass to get him in range. That's a no-no according to some defensive stalwart coaches like Bill Belichick. Always told his guys, absolutely that play can't happen. So there are going to be questions of Eberflus and the defense. There's certainly going to be questions of Shane Waldron and the offense. And Caleb didn't play well for 3 quarters. So there's enough blame to spread around. And it's tough as a team to pull yourself up from that, especially when you sort of got gifted the chance at the end of the game to win a game that you shouldn't. Now, I think we can both agree the Bears shouldn't have been in a position to win that game, but they were, and that's how this league works, and really all sports leagues. Sometimes you play like garbage all day long, and at the end of the game, you luck into the chance to steal one. And there's only 17 of these things. You need to take them when they are gifted to you. And the Bears dropped the vase on the kitchen floor. And that is inexcusable. They had a chance, multiple chances. They could have managed the offensive end of the game better and left the Commanders with very little time. They certainly could have managed the defensive end of the game that they ended up with better. And they're going to have to answer all those questions. And they also have questions inside their building about procedure penalties, about Tyreek Stevenson, not only at the end of the game, but also throughout the game. There's a lot of emotion that kind of bled over into this game. There were procedure and pre-snap penalties. And again, if you're going on the road and it's supposed to be a tight game, usually all that is enough to sink you outright and you don't get a chance at the end. And I think it's all just made a little bit more painful that they did get that chance and then squandered it in sort of historically awful fashion.
Yeah, it was, again, the last time that the Cardinals got hammered with a Hail Mary, they lucked out because it was a playoff game against the Packers during 2015 season. Aaron Rodgers hit not only one, but two of them, one to get them out of their own 5-yard line on 4th down, and the next one to win, to send the game to overtime. But the Cardinals were lucky enough to win that. And then, of course, the Hail Murray, which, again, called by Cliff Kingsbury, who was doing the play calling yesterday for Washington. So we've definitely seen both sides of that. And it's just, it was really mind-boggling watching that and seeing those, the last couple plays. Of course, like you say, I mean, there's no game that ends without multiple places where you can point to and say, hey, it's this or that. But when you're that close, that can't happen. And to me, to be honest, one of the things I think is toughest, and this is just from an outsider, and maybe all the Bears players were like, you don't know what you're talking about. But to me, the hardest part is that Stevenson's an important part of the defense because, quite frankly, that's one of those ones where you would think he's on the street the next day because to send a message that just can't happen,
Yeah, he's not going to be on the street, but DJ Moore came out and said, as captains, we have to address this. And I think what he meant is not just that thing, which you said is going to dominate the news cycle all week, and that is going to make it all the more difficult. But there were other instances in this game. His jawing with Terry McLaurin sort of got over the line. He ended up getting a flag for that. And again, it's not just him, but Stevenson is a young guy, a guy that they drafted fairly highly, that they want to play on the opposite corner from Jalen Johnson, who has shown really good flashes. But this was also the book on Stevenson when he was coming out, was that he was a very aggressive player. He was handsy. He was super emotional. And typically with young players, especially defensive backs, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's almost somewhat required for that position. But your hope as a team is that they spend the first season figuring out where the line is, both for contact in the passing game, for their emotions and how high and how hot they run, how quickly they can come back. That's going to be frustrating for the brass, and the players themselves, the captains and others, are going to have to find a way to address this because it's not okay. And they're going to hear it. They're going to see it. I mean, boy, I hope they all shut their phones off for the week because otherwise it's going to be a really, really noisy week. Well, that's what we've got. Thanks so much for coming on Bear Era and joining us today, Darren. Hope the Cardinals do really well, but not that well on this particular Sunday. Any other Sunday they could do great, but we appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have Darren on the program. Nobody more knowledgeable about the team. He's talking to not only the coaches and the players in that building every single day and has been for years. So a tremendous resource for us. Can't thank him enough for sharing his time with us here on Bear Era. Ciaran, I know you didn't get to be in that one because of some technical difficulties, but appreciate you submitting your question. And I think we'll probably reach out to Darren again when we've got Cardinals questions because he was a tremendous resource. Speaking of resources, we've got one here on the program. Our producer, Mike Mercado, every week we give him a minute to tell you exactly what he's thinking about and looking forward to in the upcoming matchup. So here it is. We give you Mike on the mic.
Thank you, EJ and Ciaran. So how you doing, Bears fans? You doing okay? You recovered yet? Yeah, me neither. But just like the Chicago Bears, it is time to put that Washington game to the past and look forward to this matchup against the Arizona Cardinals in the desert. And on this edition of Mike and the Mic, we're highlighting, can the Chicago Bears take advantage of red zone opportunities against this Cardinals defense? See, teams against the Cardinals have had 31 red zone attempts, and the Cardinals have given up 17 touchdowns in the red zone. Against the Cardinals, 50.7% of drives end in an offensive score. Caleb Williams inside the 20 is 16 of 31 with 85 yards and 6 touchdowns. Inside the 10, 11 of 17 for 58 yards and 6 touchdowns. If the Chicago Bears want to go to 5-3 on the season, if the Chicago Bears want to avoid a 2-game losing streak, if the Chicago Bears want to get right, they need to take advantage of scoring opportunities. They need to put 6 points on the board and take pressure off of this elite defense. You look back at week 1, 24 points. Week 2, 13 points. Week 3, 16 points. Week 4, 24 points. Then they explode on offense 2 straight weeks, 36 and 35 against the Panthers and Jaguars. Off a bye, 15 points against the Washington Commanders. The Chicago Bears can avoid a lot of this drama if they head into Arizona and put that ball in the end zone. This is Mike Mercado here on Mike and the Mic. Now back to EJ and Ciaran.
Always great to hear from Mike. Always happy to have him and his thoughts every week. With that, Ciaran, before we get ourselves out of here, what do you really think? Any final words about the Cardinals? I realize it's very hard not to focus on everything else, gestures at everything else going on because there's a lot of it. But as we look forward to this game with Arizona, what's one thing that you're really thinking could swing this contest and get the Bears back on the right foot?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time here talking about what happened, and I think it's important now that we look ahead to the game on Sunday, because you mentioned it, there's a real chance for the Bears to come away with a win. And the reason why I feel that way is the matchups, right? Because where Arizona have been good is where the Bears have also been good in terms of the defensive organization and what the defense has been able to do. We were talking about a Commanders team coming in that were red hot on offense and really, other than the Hail Mary, could only put up 12 points and couldn't score a touchdown. So that's where I feel confident for this team. And then when I look at it, is our biggest worry for the entire Bears team has been the offensive line. Now, the one thing is the Cardinals don't really rush the passer very much. If Caleb has time, the Bears offense should be able to score, because that's been the key. When Caleb was getting pressurized constantly, which is what was happening against the Commanders, where I think he was getting like between 2 and 3 seconds to get the ball away. Like, that's, if he's given that option to where he's actually able to scan and go through his progressions without feeling like he's under duress the whole time, the offense should be able to put up points. Again, very similarly to what we mentioned last week, there needs to be a balanced game plan between the rushing attack and the passing attack. Last week, it was a bit more where it just seemed like there was too much passing early on, and then when you look at the box score, you're like, but DeAndre Swift again getting over 100 yards, and you would expect by just looking at that the running attack was what was key for the Bears, but it didn't really happen as an overall game plan, and that's what I want to see them go back to, because if you're able to run the ball against the Cardinals and they are not able to then go after Caleb Williams and he's able to use that play action game, that's where the Bears can do what they did against the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's where they can do against the Carolina Panthers and put up points and make it easy for themselves and make people not forget what happened last week, but feel better about this team. Because if you can put it together to where the defense plays well, the offense plays well, I think it's really going to help a lot.
They've got to get off to a hotter start, certainly, than they did against the Commanders. The offensive line injuries are worrisome. It's very nice that Braxton Jones won't miss a ton of time, because the guy that shares at least the name that sounds like yours had a very rough go in his first outing at left tackle. And he hopefully will learn from that, have a little bit more practice and play a little bit better. But, Bill Murray goes on IR as well. So this is a Bears team that couldn't really afford offensive line losses. We'll have to see how they respond to that. On the Cardinals side, the guy I'm most worried about is actually Trey McBride, because the Bears haven't handled tight ends very well, especially not across the middle, and McBride can make a living there and make a difference there. So we'll see how that goes, but the Bears cannot come out with a cold start. They have to have, like you said, a more cohesive game plan. Probably means quite a bit more running in the first half, if I had to guess. Again, just to calm down the whole offensive line, Caleb, not put so much pressure on him. And we'll see how the game develops down the stretch. But I, like you, think they have a chance in this one, and a good chance if they play that kind of football. I think they are a more overall talented squad right now than the Cardinals are. We'll see if that shakes out on Sunday. Quick thanks to all our sponsors, Homage Clothing, Blue Wire Podcasts, and everybody else, all of you that listens, watches, subscribes. Make sure to click that button if you haven't, and we will be back next week to talk about not only how they did against the Cardinals, but the upcoming game against the New England Patriots. Until then, we will see you next week on Bear Era.